So Stephen, in your book, Big Pharma, Big Greed, I think one of the things that comes out of this dynamic, and I've heard this dynamic a lot with many lawyers, tort lawyers. What is it? I mean, I think it's hard. Let me put it this way. I think it's hard for lay people, for people who just go to the drugstore and buy the pharmaceuticals, get prescriptions from doctors, to not impart to the makers of drugs like some measure of social responsibility, right? And some almost like authority, because how could is it possible that people who are supplying medicine could be driven by greed? I mean, what's the best way when people sort of like question you, like, this can't be true, because what that would say about the people who are doing this would be just almost unimaginable. What is your response to that?
Well, my response is, unfortunately, that's our time that we live in, that greed has subsumed the pharma industry to such an extent that it's very difficult to trust what they say and the medications that are on the market now that you're using as a consumer. And you have to do major research yourself just to have a modicum of safety, because they unfortunately just are often very misleading in their advertising, and all too often haven't disclosed true information, important information, which is why you see so many thousands of cases being filed against them that result in big verdicts, because they are all too willing to take the risk of non-disclosure of important information or misleading information about some of their drug products. And, from everything from Risperdal growing female breasts on little boys, which is there's over 5,000 cases pending against the company now that makes Risperdal, and to baby powder with asbestos in it, to hip implants that are disintegrating, to vaginal mesh, which is a major problem in the product for women, because it leaches into their body and it causes terrible, terrible pain and problems, and it's endless. And we just can't trust the industry to monitor itself, and the FDA has developed a real problem itself.
All right. I want to talk about the sort of the regulatory framework that allows for something like this to happen. Before we get there, though, just in a general sense, what is the dynamic with these medical devices and these pharmaceuticals? They develop the product. There's so much sunk costs involved in this that, I mean, theoretically, right? I mean, nobody sets out to... my agenda is to poison people. My agenda is to get people hopelessly addicted to something. My agenda is to develop a dependency in a patient on this. And you correct me if I'm wrong. My assumption is like they develop these products with good intentions. They realize somewhere along the line that, like, wow, this isn't exactly what we thought it was going to be, but we've got so much money invested in this, we can't turn back now. In general, what is the dynamic, or is it both those things or something else?
It's the main dynamic is they want to get a major product out there, and they have a real problem with the efficacy, meaning how effective it is. And they're often looking to develop a product which doesn't cost them much money to develop. To buy a product from another small company or an inventor who came up with something, and then sell it for huge sums of money. That's their goal. I don't think they want to intentionally cause injuries. Unfortunately, once they realize there is a problem with the product, they don't like telling the true story about what the problems are, or not misleading the public about the problems with their product. That is one of the major problems we have today. And the story about it costing loads of money for pharma to develop a product, that just is a vast exaggeration. A lot of products just don't cost much at all to develop. Others do. It depends on the product, and there's no balance in the regulation, in the regulations that controls that. In other words, yeah, you may have a product that you develop for $100 or $1,000, and you have one that you developed and it cost $1 million, but there's nobody telling you you can't charge whatever you want for that product, even though it didn't cost you much to develop, or finding a way to develop a product without excessive charges. One of the biggest problems we have is that the government funds a lot of the development for the products. Universities do. And the companies then take the position, they get the product, they make all the money, and lead you to believe that they didn't get government money to develop the product. But it's just not true. In other words, when you're raising money for cancer as a public, for a public benefit, you don't know whose money was used to develop that product. Maybe it was a fundraiser for cancer or a fundraiser for Parkinson's disease. There's a lot of money sloshing around in there, but you have no idea where it came from. It certainly didn't come from Big Pharma in most of the instances.
Well, that's fascinating.
That's the big problem. There's no regulation.
So, okay. So, there's, and this is sort of, maybe a slight, derivation. We have, the government providing no regulation in terms of cost controls or profit controls. You can develop something for virtually no money, and you can sell it for as much as you could theoretically gouge of people. Much of these products are at least initially developed and researched through government grants to colleges and universities. All right. Well, I want to take a break. When we come back, because I think most people assume that not only do they assume that people who develop and manufacture and market prescription drugs and other types of medical devices have, some higher calling, I think people assume, as opposed to just profits. But there's also a presumption that the U.S. government is protecting us. And I don't think that most people have any clue, not only as to the enforcement mechanisms, but even the regulatory structure that that drugs do or do not have to wind their way through. I think most people think it's a lot more rigorous than it is. We've got to take a quick break. I'm talking to Stephen Scheller about Big Pharma and its big greed. We'll be right back after this on Ring of Fire Radio.